A jack of all trades monitor, that's exactly what the Philips Evnia 27M2N3800A claims to be, because it natively supports 4K at 160Hz and Full HD at 320Hz. It has also support for adaptive sync technologies and HDR. Better still, at the time of filming and in UK, it can be found for just £280. In fact, if you want to find it on your localized Amazon store, make sure you scan the QR code that can be found on your screen or by clicking the links down the description below or the pinned comments. Now in this video, which has been sponsored by the manufacturer, I'll be covering everything you need to know about it so you can make your own informed purchasing decision. So let's kick things off and talk about its input lag, and subjectively what I'll say is that it does a shockingly good job, both at 4K and 1080p given the overall refresh rates. Indeed, while playing a game such as Counter-Strike 2, I had no problems whatsoever when it came to registering my mouse inputs, and therefore meant that both for hardcore and casual gamers, this will certainly be appreciated. It is worth noting, however, that these comments were said with the low input lag mode enabled by the monitor's OSD. No idea why you'd ever want to disable it. I highlight this, however, because if you were to enable adaptive sync technologies, such as AMD FreeSync or Nvidia G-Sync, it will grey out the option, but seemingly still has it enabled. And therefore, yet again from my own testing, it didn't seem to incur too much extra input lag. Now another equally important factor is the overall response time, and this is very much linked with the overdrive modes that you can select via the monitor's OSD. Here you've got off, fast, faster and fastest, and I'll be actually concentrating on the latter two. Now as you go up the scale, you'll get a faster response time of the monitor itself, all while potentially getting some inverse ghosting, which in other words is that purple trailing and hazing that goes behind certain objects, and therefore it might throw you off, for example, when you're browsing the web, watching a movie, or of course gaming. Now for me to demonstrate it and highlight some of these things, I'm using the OSRTD tool. And here you can see that on the faster mode overdrive, the average initial time, which translates to the average G2G which most manufacturers claim, sits at a pretty respectable 4.06 milliseconds, and the percent in window is just shy of 87%, which is actually pretty impressive. Now this actually does get better at the fastest mode overdrive. The percent in window increases to 90%, which is actually pretty good for an LCD panel, while the average initial time drops down to just 3.4 milliseconds. However, you will be able to see that towards the middle of your screen, you've got some RGB overshoot, and I'll be showing the visual impact of this via the UFO ghosting test shortly. But before doing so, I would also like to talk about its full HD capabilities. And here at 320Hz on its faster mode overdrive, you can see that the average initial time sits at 4.14 milliseconds, and the percent in window is actually pretty low at 43%. Now this does improve on its fastest mode overdrive to going to 50%, and the average initial time drops down to 3.68 milliseconds. However, it is worth re-emphasizing over here that the percent in window means that the monitor is struggling to hit that 320Hz refresh rate range, and therefore doesn't quite compete with native 320Hz monitors out there, which simply just have got a better sort of percent in window. Now in terms of the overall visual impact, however, at 320Hz, you have got literally no overshoot to worry about, even on its fastest mode overdrive. While at 4K, you can see at 160Hz, there's a little bit of purple hazing. Now this is actually pretty acceptable if you're going to be playing less visually intensive games. If, however, you're going to be playing more graphically intense games, then you might want to dial it down to its faster mode overdrive because it is still pretty impressive in this mode. In other words, the response time is still pretty fast given the overall resolution and refresh rate. Now through the UFO test, you might have noticed an MBR setting, and that stands for motion blur reduction, and it does exactly what it says on the tin. It becomes even clearer and therefore will certainly be appreciated for those people that want that utmost sort of motion clarity. It's also good to see over here that you have got the different overdrive modes that you can still select from. And just for testing purposes, I use the fastest mode overdrive, but as I did mention before, you might want to dial it down to its faster mode preset instead. Now in terms of the MBR levels, the only caveat is the fact that it will lock the overall brightness. But you have got 20 different level increments to choose from level 1 to level 20, and therefore means that when it comes to choosing the overall brightness level of the monitor, it's still actually perfectly acceptable, be it in low light or indeed good lighting conditions. Now as an extra bonus to all of this, I also put it through its paces at 1440p. You might be wondering, why on earth are you mentioning this resolution? Well, simply because it's actually supported by the monitor, and I actually saw it present on my Nvidia control panel. And here on the UHD mode, it goes up to 160 Hz, while on the Full HD mode, it is capped at 120 Hz. Now this is actually quite important and potentially quite useful for certain individuals, because you might want to be just outputting 1440p for the time being and then moving up to 4K at a later date, for example if you upgrade your PC. Now as a result of this, using the OSRTD tool and at 160 Hz at 1440p, you'll be able to see that at its faster mode overdrive, the average initial time sits at just 3.56 milliseconds, which is actually pretty impressive, while the percent in window is very good at 90%. Now, in terms of its fastest mode overdrive, the average initial time drops down slightly to 3.3 milliseconds. However, you will be able to notice that towards the middle of your screen, you've got a lot more RGB overshoot. Indeed, over here via the UFO ghosting test, there's a little bit of inverse ghosting that occurs on its fastest mode overdrive. And yet again, the one I would suggest is the faster mode preset instead, but of course your mileage may vary. Also, it is worth mentioning that MBR is also available at 1440p, so therefore if you do want that extra bit of motion blur reduction, then you've also got it. And it is also, again, good to see that you've got the different overdrive modes that you can select from. So moving swiftly on, we get onto adaptive sync technologies, in other words AMD FreeSync and Evnia G-Sync. And here you've got a VRR range from 48 up to 160 Hz over 4K or indeed 1440p. While if you're running Full HD, it'll be 48 up to 320 Hz. Now I was actually able to put it through its paces using my RTX 3080. And it's also good to see over here that you've got full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports. And therefore I was able to run Evnia G-Sync both over DisplayPort and HDMI. And using the NVIDIA Pendulum demo, I had no sort of black screen issues or flickering to report. Better still, I was also able to run this monitor both at 4K or 1080p and also 1440p at the maximum refresh rate while running Evnia G-Sync and also HDR. Now HDR is indeed supported with this monitor, and in fact the monitor has got Display HDR 400 certification, which is nothing really to shout about. However, it does mean that the overall color accuracy in HDR is very much appreciated, and therefore means that if you're going to be playing a game with HDR capabilities, you might want to enable it. And through the monitor's OSD, you've got different HDR modes to select from, and yet again the one I would suggest is the Display HDR mode, because it'll give you the best sort of color reproduction. Just bear in mind that the overall HDR capabilities are somewhat capped due to the overall peak brightness that this monitor can achieve, and therefore won't compete with monitors that have Display HDR 600 or above, or indeed mini LED technology. Now on the subject of using HDR, you might want to pair this up when you're using a modern day console. And here I actually put it through its paces using the OSRTD tool. And at 120 Hz at 4K and its faster mode overdrive, you can see that the average initial time sits at 3.78 milliseconds, and the percent in window sitting at 93%, which is actually pretty impressive. In terms of the fastest mode overdrive, which is not what I'd recommend, you can see the average initial time sits at 3.44 milliseconds, and the percent in window is still at 93%. The reason I wouldn't recommend it is because you can see there's a lot more error when it comes to the RGB overshoot. Similarly over here, when running it at 60 Hz, and yet again at 4K, you can see in terms of the faster mode overdrive, the percent in window sits at a perfect 100%, and the average initial time sits at a pretty respectable 3.68 milliseconds. And this does indeed improve in terms of its fastest mode overdrive at 3.36 milliseconds, but again over here you can see the RGB overshoot is quite a lot of error. Now for me to demonstrate its overall visual capabilities, you'll be able to see the UFO ghosting test. And indeed, in terms of its fastest mode overdrive, there's a little bit of inverse ghosting, and this is namely present when you can see it at 60 Hz. Nonetheless, it's something you might want to use, for example, if you do want to get the utmost fastest response time of the monitor. But again, what I would recommend is going on the faster mode overdrive, because it does actually do a pretty good job. Now, there is also MBR support at 4K at 120 Hz, and this is indeed something that you might want to enable. It is also good to see that you have still got those different overdrive modes that you can select from, allowing you to kind of fine-tune the monitor to your own sort of preference. Now, it's obvious that this monitor is pretty versatile when it comes to its overall resolution and refresh rates, and therefore making it quite handy for gamers. But what about when it comes to its overall image quality? Well, here you've got a flat 27-inch matte-coated IPS panel, and I had no issues when it came to viewing angles. And given its overall form factor and its maximum resolution of 4K, it means the overall pixel density is actually pretty impressive. Of course, you can downscale this to 1440p or indeed Full HD, but of course this will affect your overall pixel density that you'll be able to attain, so you might want to play around with the window scaling options. Now, as for its overall raw color accuracy, 3D Monitor's OSD, you've got a panel native, DCI-P3 and sRGB modes. Concentrating on the latter, I was able to notice a gamma coverage of 91.3% and a gamma volume of 95.9%. Below you can see how it compares to the standard. The average delta E sat at 1.55 and a maximum of 2.74, therefore making it very much suitable for image editing work or video grading. The tested contrast ratio clocked in at 1117 to 1, while the measured white point in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target sat at 6090 Kelvin at 100%. As for the gamma curve, you can see here how it compares to the 2.2 standard. Now, if you're not going to be doing any sort of image editing work in the sRGB color space, you might want to unlock the wider color gamut of this monitor by going on the DCI-P3 or the panel native modes. The latter is the one I would suggest, namely if you're just going to be using this monitor for watching movies or indeed gaming. Now, as for the overall brightness levels, the monitor clocked in 454 nits in HDR. However, in display HDR, this does drop down to 417 nits. As for its maximum SDR brightness, it sits at 411 nits, meaning that the monitor can be used in a bright sunlit room at roughly 70 to 80% brightness. It's also good to see that it's got a minimum brightness that goes all the way down to 33 nits, and therefore meaning it can be used in a pretty pitch black environment as well. As for the overall MBR brightness, between the level 1 and 20 modes, it extends between 115 to 390 nits. And as a reminder, this will be locked brightness levels, but I do find that actually pretty acceptable. Of course, if you're going to be in a pitch black room, you might find it a little bit too bright for your needs. Following on from that, we should talk about the overall brightness uniformity, and you'll be able to see how my tested panel performed across the board. What I do appreciate is somewhat panel lottery. As for the overall backlight bleed, the same could be said about it, and over here I did find it actually perfectly acceptable for an IPS panel. So moving on from all these tests, let's talk about its overall build quality. And here you've got a 3-side borderless design, and therefore means that this 27-inch form factor monitor won't take up too much space on your desk. It's also nice to see that the built-in stand is made in part of recycled material, which is certainly appreciated for its eco-credentials. Nonetheless, it is also very versatile, as it provides you height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments. It does actually feel pretty sturdy as well. In fact, the monitor can be rotated both ways, which shows good sort of versatility. Now, it is worth pointing out that should you not want the built-in stand, you can replace it with a VESA-compatible stand with a bracket. And here this will allow you to place it on a monitor arm or a multi-monitor setup. Now, at the back of the monitor, there are no RGB lights, which I'm very much fond of because it just adds to the overall energy consumption. But there is a power LED that can be found at the front of the monitor. This, however, can be customized in terms of brightness or indeed fully disabled, which is very much appreciated. This can be done via the monitor's OSD, which can be accessed via a small little joystick button that's found at the back right-hand side of the monitor itself. The monitor's OSD itself is very comprehensively laid out, and while it does take a little bit of getting used to, in other words, the overall navigation, once you do get your head around it, it does become second nature. Now, as an extension to this, you have also got the Philips Evnia Precision Center software. And indeed over here it actually operated over DisplayPort, not needing any sort of USB cable. And that is also due to the fact that the monitor has not got any sort of USB input in the first place. Now here, the Precision Center software will give you extra degree of versatility and also some of the same controls that you'll find via the hardware-based OSD. Now this does actually bring me onto connectivity, and here you do not have any sort of USB hub, but that doesn't really bother me in the slightest. What you will find, however, is that you have got two HDMI 2.1 ports and a singular DisplayPort 1.4 input, all of which will be able to achieve the maximum refresh rate and resolution of the monitor, both at 4K and indeed at Full HD. Now it is worth mentioning that depending on how you configure the monitor and in terms of the settings that you use, you'll have different sorts of resolution and refresh rates that will appear, be it in terms of if you're going to be using this on a PC or indeed a console. So just worth playing around with the monitor settings in order to get the right sort of configuration. And yes, over HDMI, you have got a UHD 120Hz and also 160Hz mode. So you can see that the monitor manufacturer has actually dialed it in for console gamers as well. Now elsewhere, you have also got a 3.5mm jack output, which can be handy for plugging in your headphones directly into the monitor, because of course it can route audio via HDMI or DisplayPort, but you've also got two 2-watt speakers built in, which will suffice for basic music listening or indeed gaming. So there we have it. Hopefully you've enjoyed my detailed overview of this Philips monitor. I'll be curious to know down in the comment section below what you make of it, and furthermore, if you'd utilize that dual mode capabilities on a frequent basis. Now as a reminder, if you do want to find this monitor on Amazon, make sure you scan this QR code on your screen, or indeed by following the links down in the description below or the pinned comments. If you've enjoyed this detailed video, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing, and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I hope you see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.